Oh, you're muted, Larry.
There we go. Thank you for that. Hello, my name is Larry Glover Mead, Training Specialist in the Office of Grant Administration for AmeriCorps. Welcome to Best Practices in Budget Development Office Hour for fiscal year 2025 AmeriCorps State and National Native Nations applicants and Native Nations Planning Grant applicants. As you've heard, we're recording this webinar and we'll post the session recording on the competition funding pages. This office hour is an opportunity for you to ask questions to clarify the content included in the budget-related sections of the Notice of Funding Opportunity and application instructions, along with the best practices of budget development recording and sample budget narratives available on the funding opportunity pages of the AmeriCorps.gov website. If you haven't yet reviewed those resources, I encourage you to do so following this office hour call, so you can understand the best practices for creating a compliant and competitive AmeriCorps grant budget. During today's office hour, we will not respond to questions about the specific content of your proposed budget. Rather, we will provide clarifications to help you submit a compliant budget and budget narrative. Please note that only cost reimbursement applicants will submit a detailed budget narrative. However, like the best practices in budget development recording, the content shared here may be helpful for all applicants, both cost reimbursement and fixed amount award applicants. As a reminder, new applicants may not apply for full cost fixed amount awards. They may, however, apply for Education Award Program funding, also referenced as EAP awards or professional core programs. Before I open the floor for your questions, I want to take a few minutes to review the function of an effective AmeriCorps budget and budget narrative and highlight some of the key information that will help you submit a budget that not only includes costs that are allowable, reasonable, necessary, and allocable as determined by Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations 2 CFR 200, the Office of Management and Budget's Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards, frequently referred to as the Uniform Guidance. Because the budget and budget narrative become part of the grant recipient's contract with AmeriCorps, AmeriCorps wants and expects applicants to present a strong and accurate document. The approved budget will not only serve as a financial guide for grant-supported activities, it helps to ensure compliance with the terms and conditions of the award. In addition to helping AmeriCorps monitor grant and fiscal compliance, it can serve as a tool for both AmeriCorps and award recipients to measure progress towards any match requirements and for grantees to monitor budgeted expenses to actual expenses, a key part of the funds management process. Before I dive into the details of budget development, I want to point out that budget development is just one component of an effective budget and funds management process. Let's take a quick look at the full process. As you started to work on your application, you may have asked yourself, how do I design a strong budget? Whether you started the process with that question or not, as part of the pre-award project development process, it's likely that your team has already determined the needs you wanted to address with AmeriCorps resources, set up program or project goals and objectives to address these needs, and decided on a strategy to accomplish these goals. To develop the budget, applicants must translate that strategy into dollars in order to prepare a budget that aligned with the stated program goals and objectives. Post-award, grantees will continue to manage their budgets effectively by establishing a budget control process, monitoring expenses, that is, regularly comparing your budgeted to actual expenses to check for over and under spending, and modifying the budget as necessary with approval from AmeriCorps when required. Your budget control process and ongoing monitoring of expenses are key components of funds management. I highlight the importance of funds management now during the application process, so it's something you are aware of and can plan for should AmeriCorps grant your award. Funds management is very important to AmeriCorps and to the federal government. Let's talk about the basics. Your approved budget should be realistic. That is, it should reflect expected program revenues and expenses and its capacity to carry out program activities. It should be consistent and aligned with the program's goals and objectives as described in the program narrative. And it should be flexible. A project's financial and operating circumstances often change, and the budget must adapt to those changing circumstances. Additionally, it should be accurate. The figures and descriptions in the budget narrative should not be guesswork. It should be vetted details that the applicant understands how the program budget will be viewed. Let's focus on the first bullet point, realistic. Your strong budget design provides a framework for effective budget management and ensures a realistic scope, appropriate detail, a competitive and compelling proposal, compliance, and effective delivery. That is, it serves as a guide for program implementation. In order to create a budget that is strong, accurate, and requires minimal resolution, I encourage you to take your time and engage others in data collection and quality review. AmeriCorps anticipates making 3-year grant awards. AmeriCorps generally makes an initial award for the first year of the period of performance based on a 1-year budget. Applicants must submit a 1-year budget. Planning grants are limited to a 12-month planning period. Some additional information about cost per member service year, MSY. Full-time fixed amount, maximum cost per MSY is $25,000 and are required to provide member living allowances that meet the minimum and maximum requirements. EAP, maximum cost per MSY is $800 for any type of slot. Organizations are not required to providing living allowances, but if they do, they must comply with the maximum requirements. In addition, EAP applications may have a $1,000 maximum cost per MSY if disadvantaged youth comprise at least 50% of individuals enrolled in the program. Professional Corps, fixed amount awards only with a maximum cost per MSY is $1,000. If the applicant demonstrates significant organizational financial need. Generally, living allowance and salaries, as well as benefits, are paid by the applicant organization and not included in the budget request to AmeriCorps for the federal share. The organization must provide a member living allowance or salary that meets the minimum requirements and may exceed the maximum living allowance, and it also may include full-time members only. Planning grants have no cost per MSY since there aren't any MSYs. As stated in the notice, professional corps grantees must provide members a living allowance or salary. Organizations must pay members the minimum and can exceed the maximum. Professional corps member salaries and benefits, including childcare, cannot be included in the federal share budget request to AmeriCorps. Our session today will include several tips and tools for creating a competitive budget narrative. The first tip is to read and follow the instructions in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, also called the notice, and the application instructions, which include minimum and maximum cost levels and required line items. And follow the detailed budget instructions in the application instructions. I also encourage you to become familiar with the uniform guidance and only include those costs that are allowable, reasonable, necessary, and allocable. You will find the uniform guidance online and in the chat under Title II, Grants and Agreements. The link is listed on the page, as well as chat. After you and your team estimate the financial resources you need to achieve the stated program goals, you will organize them into the narrative budget categories, following the guidance in the notice and application instructions. As you develop the budget narrative, remember to provide adequate descriptions and clear and accurate calculations. Speaking of uniform guidance, effective October 1st, 2024, updates to uniform guidance, or the 2 CFR 200, introduced several revisions that may impact how budgets are prepared and managed. We want to highlight these recent changes. Direct costs, expanded eligibility that now allows costs related to cybersecurity, integrated data systems, and program evaluation to be treated as direct costs if they're actually tied to the specific award. De minimis indirect rate. The rate has increased from 10% to 15% of the modified total directs, providing more flexibility for organizations without a federally approved indirect cost rate. Organization costs. Costs related to data gathering, storage, and evaluation are explicitly allowable, enhancing the ability to allocate resources for data-driven program improvements. And finally, increased financial thresholds. Equipment thresholds were raised from $5,000 to $10,000, and the supplies threshold was raised from $5,000 to $10,000. These revisions provide opportunities for improved budget flexibility and compliance. Be sure to review your current processes and adjust them to align with these new guidelines. The uniform guidance, as well as the notice and application instructions, is also a great resource when identifying costs considered unallowable, such as lobbying, entertainment, alcoholic beverages, and fundraising. AmeriCorps strongly encourage applicants to review the uniform guidance to avoid including unallowable costs in your proposed budget. Other unallowable costs include those that are not necessary to meet the program objectives, are considered unreasonable from a prudent person perspective, or have no logical basis for inclusion in the budget. Additionally, remember that a planning grant budget may not include costs used to support AmeriCorps members. I'll turn it over to my colleague Joseph to talk more about match requirements and indirect costs.
Thank you, Larry. Yeah, I'll introduce myself. My name is Joseph Edwards. I'm the Supervisory Grants Management Specialist in the Office of Grant Administration. So continuing on, I'm going to start discussing match requirements, which is also, along with the uniform guidance, we have some updates since last year's Notice of Opportunity funding. So match requirements are waived for this funding opportunity to reduce burden, and this is per Executive Order 14112, which was called Reforming Federal Funding and Support for Tribal Nations to Better Embrace Our Trust Responsibilities. So applicants for this notice and the planning grant notice are no longer required to meet the traditional AmeriCorps State National match standards. The grantee share can still be included in the budget, but it is not required, and there's no set percentage to be met. This is true for cost reimbursement grants. For fixed award grants, there is no match requirement. So, along with this exciting news about match requirements being waived, I also want to talk about match replacement funds. So, if an applicant applying for this NOFO can verify it meets the standards of operating in what we call a severely economically distressed community, then match replacement funds are available. Match replacement funds are additional AmeriCorps funds up to the amount that would have been contributed by the recipient if the match requirement was not waived. So this chart on this slide illustrates what those requirements would be with the funding year. So in this next slide, we'll do a little kind of mock calculation just to help you highlight how match replacement funds are calculated. This is a visual example. Let's suppose we have an application that is in year 4 and is requesting $100,000 in federal funds for their program. So with a year 4 as a cost reimbursement match, that applicant would have a 26% waived match requirement. It's highlighted in red right here. If the applicant can prove that they are located in a severely economically distressed area, then this applicant may request up to $35,135 in the grantee share as match replacement funding. Applicants indicate the amount of requested match replacement in the sources of funds section of the budget. And again, last very important reminder, the match replacement funds must be budgeted in just the grantee share. I know I just said that, but it's a really important point to highlight. So if you look at the second bullet point here, it has a little bit of the calculation. When we say 26% match, that is 26% of the total submitted budget. It is not 26% of just the federal award funds that you're requesting. So if you look at this calculation, the total of $135,135 If you break that up, 100,000 federal funds is 74%, and then 35,135 is the 26%. We have a little bit more about source of funds sections in just a minute. So next, I wanted to talk about the budget structure. As you enter your data into your budget, you will notice that the structure includes both the AmeriCorps and grantee share per the project costs. And the AmeriCorps share is also known as the federal share, and in e-grants, it's called the CNCS share. AmeriCorps share, federal share, CNCS share, those are all the same thing. Additionally, the budget classified costs in direct or indirect or administrative cost sections. Direct costs include program operating costs, such as the member cost. We have the budget breaks into the major categories that we're about to get into that include specific line items, such as those on this slide. These costs are allocable to the grant. That is, they are associated with the program goals and grant-related activities. General or centralized organizational expenses that are spread across an entire organization for common goals, those are known as indirect or administrative costs. And we'll get to indirect costs in just a second. I wanted to highlight the application instructions provide specific detail to help you determine which costs go into which budget category and what detail to include in all of the individual line item descriptions. The detailed budget instructions for AmeriCorps State National cost reimbursement applications are in attachments B and C of the application instructions. For fixed amount grants, those are in attachments D and E of the application instructions. Please be aware that the application instructions are applicable to various grant competitions. You should review the notice for specific details for the type of competition that you are applying. As you develop your budget management system, and specifically the budget control and funds management process, you'll want to establish clear policies and procedures for tracking and documenting these expenses if you do not already have them. Okay, so like I mentioned a second ago, indirect costs. As applicants who choose to include indirect costs into their budgets may calculate them in Section 3 of the budget using one of two methods referenced in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. What the notice does not mention is a third method, and that is the corporation fixed percentage, which is referenced in the application instructions as the CNCS fixed percentage method and the 5-10% fixed administrative cost option. I want to spend a few minutes discussing that option for calculating indirect costs specifically. As stated in the application instructions, applicants may charge indirect costs without a federally approved indirect cost rate and without documentation to support the allocations. Using this method, applicants can allocate 5% of the CNCS share of direct costs to the CNCN share of indirect costs, and 15% of all direct costs, the total of both the AmeriCorps and grantee share, that grantee share of indirect costs. Applicants will then follow the guidance in the application instructions to calculate the maximum allowable. If you're using this method and allocating less than the maximum allowed, please note that the percentage claimed in the budget narrative. Additionally, if an applicant has a federally approved indirect cost rate from the federal government, they must use this method, and the approved rate agreement constitutes documentation of the indirect cost. Like the corporation fixed percentage method, the CNCS share is limited to 5% of AmeriCorps funds. The third calculation to use indirect cost is the de minimis rate of 15% of modified total direct costs. As Larry mentioned earlier, with changes in the uniform guidance, this was previously 10%. It is now, as of October 24, 15%. It is available to organizations who do not have a federally negotiated indirect cost rate and who receive less than $35 million in direct federal funding. And if elected, this must be used consistently across all the organization's other federal awards. Once again, using this method, the CNCN share is limited to just 5% of the AmeriCorps funds. Again, guidance for calculating these costs using each of these methods is in the application instructions. Please pay close attention to the calculation guidance to avoid having to correct your calculation during the resolution process. Regardless of the calculation method used, the CNCS share of indirect cost is always limited to 5% of the total AmeriCorps award funds expended. Now, the recorded instruction and sample budgets are on the funding opportunity page, provide examples of indirect cost budget narrative entry using a federally approved indirect cost rate and using the de minimis rate. I want to take just another moment to show you how a budget narrative using the corporation fixed percentage looks like. So on this slide here, we're going to be doing quite a bit of calculating. And so I hope you follow along, but we cannot stress again, the application instructions are the best resource to help you provide calculations for your award. There are only two places to enter these as details in e-grants. Applicants who choose the corporation fixed percentage will enter the line item details in section 3A, as shown in the recorded instruction. Applicants who have a federally approved indirect cost rate or de minimis rate will enter items in section 3B. If you use the corporation fixed percentage, which we're about to get into, like the other two methods, you will use the guidance in the application instructions to determine the maximum amount you may budget. The guidance provides very specific calculation details. Not using the calculation methods as directed will likely result in you needing to revise your budget as part of the resolution process. The instructions tell you to determine the maximum CNCS share of Section 3. So you multiply the sum of the CNCS funding share of Sections 1 and 2 by 0.0526. If we go back to this sample budget that's on the funding opportunity page, you see that the CNCS share of Section 1 is $271,817. And the CNCS share of Section 2 is $807,966. To determine the maximum allowable CNCS share of indirect cost, you will add these two amounts to get a total of $1,079,783. And then multiply that figure by 0.0526 for a total of $56,797. This is the maximum amount you may budget in the CNCS share of Section 3. It's important to note that you are not required to budget the full amount or any amount in the indirect cost section. However, if you include indirect cost in your budget at less than the maximum, you should indicate the amount claimed as part of the description. So going on with the application instruction state, to determine the grantee share for Section 3, multiply the total of both the CNCS and grantee share of Sections 1 and 2 by 10%. So we'll take the Section 1 total of $334,152 and add that to the Section 2 total of $1,487,579 for a sum of $1,821,731. If you multiply that by 10%, you will get $182,173, which is the maximum amount you may budget in the grantee share of indirect cost using the corporation fixed percentage method. When entered in the budget, it should look similar to this example in terms of the description. But you might be curious, what's this line, the commission fixed award amount that's on the budget? So applicants that apply to AmeriCorps as a sub-applicant of a state service commission may be required to budget a portion of their indirect cost in this line as well. State service commissions may elect to retain a share of the indirect costs for their own administrative cost. When they do so, applicants will budget for them using the specific guidance in the application instructions. Again, I advise you to pay very close attention to the instructions and follow the calculation guidance exactly to avoid having to revise your budget for calculation errors. Okay, so moving on to, I will now review specific budget categories that you'll see on the budget and the related guidance in the AmeriCorps application instructions. I'll begin with Section 1, Program Operating Costs. Both operating grants and planning grant applicants will compete this section. However, any member-related costs such as member travel, member gear, member training, and the National Service criminal history checks, which are very important, are not allowable on planning grant budgets. Before we go into specifics of your budget design, I want to remind you that while operating grant awards will vary because it's determined by the scope of the projects, planning grants, just planning grants, are limited to a maximum of $240,000 for a 12-month period. You'll want to keep this in mind as you develop your budgets. So in Section A, personnel expenses, Applicants will individually list each staff position that's supported by the grant. In any grants by position title, listing the number of individuals in that position and providing the annual salary and level of effort as percentage of a full-time equivalent or FTE devoted to this award. From there, you will determine how much to allocate to the CNCS share and the grantee share of the budget. When entering these details, please remember, only include positions supported by the application narrative that you submit along with the budget. In addition, if you have other AmeriCorps grants, it is a good idea to confirm that you are not over budgeting. That is, including more than 100% staff time on your budgets between the grants. Applicants can do this by including a little statement in each line that states, the percentage of time allocated to budget staff does not exceed 100% across all AmeriCorps grants. Additionally, applicants should confirm that the salary information provided is consistent across the multiple grants. Let's say a program director's salary is $69,000 on one application and $79,000 on another application you submit 6 months later. You should add an explanation for the higher salary. Okay, next slide. All right, next up is Section B, personnel fringe benefits, which is very much in tandem with Section A. Applicants will identify the type of fringe benefits that they offer, including FICA, health, life insurance, workers' comp, retirement costs, et cetera, and the cost for each staff. So for fringe benefits, the cost should align along the lines with the salary. That is the category that you should only use staff included in the personnel expenses category. If the benefit is more than 30% of the salary cost, applicants must list the covered benefits separately and justify the cost. That doesn't mean that applicants need to break out each expense in its own line item. Applicants might state something like health and life insurance 22%, FICA 7.65%, retirement 4.2%, and state unemployment insurance 1%, rather than just stating all fringe benefits total 37.1% of the related salary cost. You will see an example of this in the sample budget that's posted on the funding opportunity page. I also want to note that applicants do not need to create an individual line for each benefit that connects to the personnel expenses line. In other words, you don't need to have 8 lines that say 8 health insurances. If you have 8 staff or 8 life insurances, you can do that in one big calculation with the level of detail. The next section is Section C, travel. So when you're budgeting out travel, please include the purpose of the travel and the type of travel costs, such as airfare, transportation, lodging, per diem, etc. The number of trips, and of course, the number of staff or staff traveling. Make sure this calculation is clearly described. AmeriCorps expects that all direct applicants, if you are like, for example, a national direct applicant, to include travel funds to attend the AmeriCorps-sponsored annual symposium. We expect at least one staff member, especially a new staff member, to attend the symposium and pre-conference events when those are available. All applicants should include funds in this budget section for staff travel to other technical assistance meetings as required. Take care to ensure that the training costs are not included in this category. The travel costs aren't included in the training lines either. For operating grant applicants, separate staff travel and member travel costs. Planning grant applications, just a reminder, you don't have any members, so you won't need to budget for member travel. Applicants may also budget mileage at a rate higher than the federal reimbursement rate, which the federal reimbursement rate right now is 67 cents a mile as of January 1st, 2024, if that follows the organization's policy. So please make a note in the budget narrative. The next section is Section D, which is equipment. Expenses are defined as tangible, non-expendable personal property having a useful life of more than 1 year and an acquisition cost of $10,000 or more per unit. If it is less, then that expense shouldn't be in the equipment category, but should be in the supplies category, regardless of how your organization defines equipment. Purchase of equipment are limited to 10% of total AmeriCorps funds requested. When including equipment cost, applicants must show the units and the justification for the equipment for that program in the budget narrative. So next section, Section E, supplies. Costs are consumable supplies and materials, including member service gear. AmeriCorps members identify preferably clothing with the AmeriCorps logo is very common. as a required budget expense for operating grant applicants and may be charged to the CNCN share only if it includes the AmeriCorps logo. Applicants should make a note in the budget narrative when items include the AmeriCorps logo. This is not required of planning grants, again, because they don't have members. Operating grants, applicants may charge safety gear to the CNCS share, whether it has a logo or not. Organizations must purchase any non-logoed member service gear with non-AmeriCorps funds. So when you're including supplies in your budget, please make sure to individually list single items costing $1,000 or more. That doesn't mean your budget needs to include a $1,000 line item for general office supplies. You just need to itemize the cost of things like paper or pens if it increases over $1,000. However, if you're purchasing like a $2,500 copy machine or printer, you cannot incorporate it into office equipment with other items. The printer, that would probably need to be its own line item at that level of funding. All right, next section is, we're going to go with section F, contractual and consultant services. Applicants will include all contractual and consultant services except for training and evaluation consultants. While AmeriCorps does not impose a maximum daily rate, we ask applicants to include the basis and provide detail of the calculation for that expense at a daily rate. Again, do not need to include the value of direct community service performed by volunteers here or in the personnel sections unless it's for organizational functions such as equipment maintenance or accounting or recruitment. The next section is training, section G. This includes expenses related to staff training and for operating grant applicants only, not for member training. Staff training includes anything related to the project or training to enhance the skills of staff needed to make an effective project. Member training includes the cost of training members to effectively carry out their activities and may include a life after AmeriCorps training as well. Being sure to include a daily rate for consultants if used for training, as I just mentioned a second ago. Alrighty, I'll go ahead and go to the next section, H, evaluation. This includes the cost of project evaluation activities, including additional staff, consultants, evaluation instruments, etc. This is not for assessing progress towards performance measures, but a larger assessment of the impact of your project has on the community and an assessment of the overall systems and program design. Again, please use a daily rate if contractors are involved. Now, section I, other program cost. This is admittedly a bit of a catch-all category for those project expenses that don't really neatly fit into the other ones that we've just talked about. However, this must include the national service criminal history checks for members, employees, and others who receive a salary, education award, living allowance stipend, any personnel connected to the staff, connected to the grant, excuse me. If these costs are not included, please explain how the costs are covered in a note and the checks have already been completed. Applicants may include office space, utilities, phone, internet, similar expenses for members and project staff, providing expenses that are not included as part of the organization's approved indirect cost rate. They are prorated and allocated to the project. You do need to include in the description. Operating grant applicants may also include member recognition events costs here, which are allowable if appropriately justified and if they exclude gifts and food provided in an entertainment setting. So let me give you, here's a couple of a good sample on the next slide, another budget narrative sample entry. So here's the first draft. So this is for staff travel. You can see here, this applicant, if you squint, you can read included AmeriCorps sponsored grantee training, but this example did not include a cost calculation to explain how they determined the $2,808. So while required, the cost might not meet a prudent person standards. Let's say if you're going from Maryland to DC, that seems like a little excessive. In the second line item here, the applicant proposed a mileage rate higher than the federal rate. So again, that's allowable, but you have to provide it that it aligns with the organization's policy. The applicant could avoid having to clarify this rate by making a budget narrative notation that follows the organization's travel policy. Just a little note like that. An example of that is included in the last line of this category. The third line here shows an applicant did not double check the calculations for accuracy. The details in the description of $2,111 rather than budgeted $1,987 if you've done the math. This often results when applicants revise a budget category, but forget to double check the totals that are listed there. So the last line in this category, or excuse me, the last line in this little entry is cost for member travel. And as we stated a little bit ago, member travel is a very allowable cost for operating grants, but there is a specific member travel category later in part two, section 2 of the budget, and it's important to check that you're entering line items in the correct appropriate budget category. So this next example at the bottom shows a correct and comprehensive entry. So adequate details include for each item, including the number of individuals traveling, the number of travel days, mileage rate, all the calculations for the total budget amounts, and there are no erroneous costs are included in this category. So we wanted to give you an example of a not good version and a good version. All right, I'll give you one more sample entry before I kick it back to Larry. So this is for the supplies category. In this first line, you can see that the applicant provided an average monthly cost of the office supplies, but that calculation, if you look at it, is incorrect. It appears to be based on only 10 months of costs. The computer line item is budgeted at $2,200 and includes no detail. We don't know how many computers they are proposing to buy, and if this line is just for computers, or if other items are included. So without this detail, we can't determine if this cost is reasonable or necessary. So also remember that the application instructions state that applicants must specifically list all single supply items with a cost of more of $1,000 per unit. We don't know if this line item includes any single item cost more than $1,000. So next, after that is the printer line item calculation shows that the cost is $650, but the applicant budgeted $550. So we don't know which is correct, what's in the description or what's in the total. After that is the member supplies line item, which is another line that is only applicable for operating grants. It includes a cost per member and the number of members. That's great. However, when you calculate this, the total is $20,700, is a bit higher than what is budgeted. I recommend adding, you can use terms like average, approximate, estimated for a description like this that is one that is included to office supplies to provide some flexibility. And as I review the sample, I also noticed that it doesn't include AmeriCorps service gear at all in the supplies. If this is an operating grant, a member gear is required for our members. So that's the first entry. Here's the second entry, the second version of the budget, which includes all the things I just referenced. Member gear, it has appropriate detail. All the other revisions includes the corrected office supplies calculation and details for the computer, corrected calculation for the printer, uses that word average. So this second example is a much better, much more compliant budget narrative for the supplies category. All right, so we're actually going to switch over to member costs, and I will throw it back to my colleague, Larry.
Great, thank you. So let's move on to section 2, which focuses on member costs, specifically member living allowances and support costs. Again, this section is only applicable to applicants applying for an operating grant. Planning grant applicants will not include any member-related costs in their budgets. The Notice of Funding Opportunity stipulates the minimum and maximum living allowances. This year's full-time living allowance ranges between $20,400 and $40,800 per member. Like the personal expenses category, the living allowance budget category will identify the number of members you are requesting in each category and the living allowance amount they will receive, or note that they will not receive an allowance. Programs are not required to provide a living allowance for members serving in less than full terms of service. If a program chooses to provide a living allowance to a less than full-time member, it must comply with the maximum limits in the table below. Member support costs. They must follow the laws of the states in which members serve. For FICA, unless exempted by the IRS, is 7.65% of the total living allowance. When applicants have an IRS exemption, they must make note of it in the budget narrative. Applicants must offer healthcare benefits to all full-time members. I'll say that again, full-time members. Programs may not pay healthcare benefits to less than full-time members with grant funds, whether in the AmeriCorps or grantee share of the budget, unless those less than full-time members are serving in a full-time capacity for a sustained period of time, such as in a full-time summer program. In that case, applicants should note that in the budget narrative. Please include the number of members receiving the benefit and a per-person cost in the cost calculation. If you calculate costs based on the percentage of members that historically accept or that you anticipate will accept this benefit, make sure to note that in the justification. Please be aware that if you are covering healthcare costs with Indian Health Services resources, you may not include the cost of coverage on this AmeriCorps budget. If that's the case, I recommend noting that you are offering healthcare to full-time members and covering the cost with Indian Health Services resources in the narrative, and then enter 0 in the AmeriCorps and grantee shares of the budget. Applicants may include workers' compensation costs if the state where members are serving requires it. If it is not required, programs must obtain occupational, accidental, death, and dismember coverage for members. Be aware that it's the applicant's responsibilities to check with the State Department of Labor or the State Service Commission to determine if you are required to pay workers' compensation, and if so, at what level. Unemployment insurance and other member support costs must also include adequate calculation details. Applicants may not charge the cost of unemployment insurance taxes to the grant unless it is mandated by state law. Let's now consider a sample member support cost category that includes some errors. This applicant included the required FICA for members, but calculated using an incorrect percentage. According to the application instructions, applicants must calculate FICA at 7.65% of total living allowances. In the healthcare line item, the applicant seems to have estimated that a number of eligible members will decline the benefit. There's no requirement that applicants provide healthcare benefits to all full-time members, only that they offer it to all full-time members. When applicants budget for less than all full-time members, they generally base it on some sort of historical information. The inclusion of the term estimated provides flexibility, should more or fewer members accept the benefit. It's important to note that when applicants estimate that fewer than all members will accept the coverage, as a grantee, they must be prepared to cover the related costs and amend the budget as needed if more members accept that coverage. This healthcare line also includes healthcare benefits for 9 of 10 3/4 time members. This might be allowable, but only if the 3/4 time members are serving in a full-time capacity. It also seems like the $6,000 per member cost may be for a year of coverage. If the 3/4 time members are eligible for the healthcare benefit, this cost would likely need to be prorated to reflect the duration of service. If this line item was part of a submitted budget, it would likely result in a request for confirmation that these are less than full-time members serving in a full-time capacity and the costs are properly allocated. Otherwise, the cost is unallowable. Are there any required line items missing here? What about workers' compensation that the application instructions state is a required line item? If the state requires workers' compensation coverage for AmeriCorps members. If the state does not, AmeriCorps requires grantees to obtain occupational, accidental, death, and dismember coverage for members. One of these two costs must be included in the budget. Similarly, the applicant must include state unemployment insurance if the state where the members serve requires it. The second example includes the correct FICA calculation. Additionally, the healthcare line item was corrected to exclude the 3/4 time members that apparently were not serving in a full-time capacity. And this example includes a line for the required members' workers' compensation cost and state unemployment insurance. This is a much more compliant budget that meets the AmeriCorps requirements. Now it's time to review some budgeted indirect cost items. Regardless of which method applicants use, if they decide to include indirect costs in their budget, they will enter those details in section 3B of the eGrants application. The first example shows an applicant with a federally approved indirect cost rate. As requested in the application instructions, They provided the cost type, the basis on which it is calculated, the approved time, the rate claimed, and they detailed the cost calculation. In this example, the final rate is based on total salaries and fringe benefits. While we did review these categories of the budget narrative, the applicant noted that the two categories total $188,773. You can see details of this in the sample budget narrative on the funding opportunity page of AmeriCorps.gov. The applicant multiplied the total of the salaries and fringe benefits by the approved rate of 48% to get the maximum allowable indirect cost total of $90,611. In this example, however, the applicant is choosing to claim just 45% of a budgeted total of $84,948. As we know, the CNCS share of indirect costs is limited to 5% of the total CNCS share of direct costs. And the applicant shows us in this example that 5% is $56,797. After determining the maximum amount indirect cost rate, you must enter the details of it in eGrants using the AmeriCorps eGrants indirect cost rate user instructions linked in the applications, and make sure to calculate the cost using the details of this rate. In the second example, the applicant does not have a federally approved indirect cost rate, and as an alternative, uses the de minimis rate. The details of this rate go in the same place as the details using a federally negotiated indirect cost rate in Section 3B. Here, the applicant noted that 10% of the modified total direct cost is $182,173. As in the previous entry, they provided the CNCS share calculation to reach $56,797, and then subtracted that from $182,173 to get the grantee share of $125,376. As with the federally negotiated rate, applicants using a de minimis rate will enter the details of that rate in eGrants using the AmeriCorps eGrants indirect cost rate user instructions. I do want to note that applicants who applied for a federally negotiated indirect cost rate that hasn't yet been approved should use the de minimis rate to budget any indirect costs, knowing that they can revise their budget when the negotiated rate is approved. Similarly, applicants who have an approved rate that expired or will soon expire should note that the new approval is pending and provide an expected approval date in the budget narrative. If the rate is not approved by the time of the award, AmeriCorps may request that you revise the budget using the de minimis rate. In rare circumstances, AmeriCorps may approve the award with a special condition to amend the budget upon approval of a new rate. The last section of the budget narrative is the source of funds section, which we referenced earlier when discussing match replacement funds. In it, applicants won't list budgeted line items or item costs. Rather, they'll enter the source of any and all matching resources included in the proposed budget. To complete the section, under the Budget Section 3 tab, you will find a link to enter source of matching funds, as shown here. Once you click that link, a new screen will open where applicants will enter the source. Please be sure to include a brief description of the source of the match and whether the resource is secured or proposed, the dollar amount of the matching resource, the match classification, cash or in kind, and the source type, private resources, state or local funds or federal funds in the appropriate field. You will complete these steps for each source for your entire match. If you decide to utilize match replacement funds, write those exact words on this description for the dollar amount. Before moving on, I caution you to update this section as well as the indirect cost section after making any budget revisions so they reflect all changes. The source of funds total must equal the total amount of resources in the grantee share of the budget exactly. Even a $1 variance is considered non-compliant and will require you to address the non-compliance during resolution. As previously stated, while there is no cost share or matching requirement for fixed amount grants, AmeriCorps does not provide all the funds necessary to operate the program. organizations should raise the additional revenue required to operate the program. To be complete and compliant, fixed amount applicants must identify the source of the additional resources that will support the program in the source of funds section. And like the source of funds section for cost reimbursement grant applicants, the fixed amount application source of funds section must equal the total amount of resources in the grantee share of the budget. Exactly. When complete, the source of funds section might include content similar to this example. Note that this only includes the source of the match, not the specific budget categories or line items covered by the matching funds. And it provides the required details, noting whether the resources are secured or proposed, in-kind donations or cash, and provided by a private or government entity. If you're going to use match replacement funds, as we just discussed, here is what an entry would look like. In the description, you see match replacement funds. The amount needs to be exactly what the cost reimbursement match requirement would be. Classification is cash, and the source is federal. When completing the section, please take care as you use the drop-down menus. It is very easy to change the selected classification or source. Incorrectly entering this information may result in a request for clarification during the resolution process. We wanted to highlight one more common budget preparation question that involves everyone's favorite topic of food and meals. Can meals be included at all budgeted in the program budget? Is it allowable? The answer is yes in certain situations. Most commonly, we recommend going to the Uniform Guidance section 200.432 conferences. In the guidance, it stipulates that meals and refreshments are allowable when there is a dissemination of information, like a conference, convening, seminar, or symposium. This has been asked in previous budget development webinars, and we wanted to make sure to highlight this information. In addition, before submitting your application, please make sure that your organization has an active registration with the System for Award Management and a Unique Entity Identifier, or UEI. All applicants must register with the System for Award Management at www.sam.gov and maintain an active sam.gov registration until the application process is complete. AmeriCorps will not process an award if the SAM.gov registration is not active. Once an applicant is awarded a grant, the organization must contain an active SAM.gov registration throughout the life of the award. If you are applying to SAM.gov for the first time, I recommend that you apply early, as it can take a while to activate the registration. AmeriCorps recommends that you apply or renew for your registration at least 3 weeks prior to the application deadline to allow time to resolve any issues that may arise. Applicants must use their SAM.gov registered legal name and physical address on all AmeriCorps grant applications. If the name and address on the application doesn't match the SAM.gov record exactly, it will delay award processing. Please know that SAM.gov registration is a free service. Organizations should never pay for SAM.gov registration. Also, make sure to submit your organization's operational and financial management survey as directed in the notice. You must also submit your most recent single audit to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse as appropriate. And finally, if you are budgeting indirect costs, please be sure to enter your current federally negotiated indirect cost rate details or the de minimis rate details in eGrants using the guidance in the application instructions. These are a few of the resources the AmeriCorps team reviews as part of the pre-award risk assessment referenced in the notice. For more information about the due diligence specific assessments, I encourage you to review the recorded due diligence review and compliance training referenced in the notice of funding opportunity. This and other trainings to support applicants and grantees are listed on the manager grant page of the AmeriCorps.gov website. Finally, AmeriCorps is aware that on occasion, applicants experience challenges with the eGrant system. eGrants automatically performs a limited compliance check to validate the budget as described in the application instructions. This check may result in a warning or error message. Some of these messages prevent you from submitting your application, so you should be aware of the differences and related actions. For instance, when you receive a warning, you can move forward with your submission, but the application or budget may not be compliant with the guidelines. On the other hand, an error message will not allow you to proceed until you edit the data. You must correct all errors before you can submit your application. If you experience a challenge other than a warning or error message, you should contact the AmeriCorps hotline right away. The number is 1-800-942-2677, and a link to the help request form is at the bottom of most eGrant pages. It's wise to forward a copy of the service ticket to AmeriCorps grants at cns.gov so AmeriCorps has documentation of the problem. I want to draw your attention back to these bullets that I shared earlier. I encourage you to keep this checklist nearby as you develop your budget and frequently consult it as a budget development guide and quality assurance checklist. Many budgets require extensive revisions, in part because applicants don't follow the points outlined here. You will save yourself a great deal of follow-up by checking your proposed budget against this checklist before submitting it to AmeriCorps. This concludes our budget overview, and it's time we've been waiting for, an opportunity to ask any clarifying questions about AmeriCorps budget. You can either enter your questions in the Q&A panel or raise your hand and we'll unmute your line so you can ask by voice.
We thank everyone for joining, and we know that we're running really close to the hour mark, but yes, if you have any questions, as Larry just said, please feel free to put in the chat or in the Q&A box. Right. I'll take that silence as no questions. Again, I think last point, I know Larry and I have made this both a lot today. The application instructions and notice of funding opportunity are the two best resources. Most questions can be answered directly there. And we really encourage everyone to utilize the other resources on the funding opportunity page when planning your grant. Best of luck on your grant application, and that'll conclude today's sessions. Have a good one.